Every year, the HACR Research Institute publishes landmark studies on both corporate best practices and the state of the Hispanic community around its 4 pillars. HACR research drives thought leadership and empowers stakeholders to create a more inclusive corporate America that both works with and invests in the Hispanic community. Every initiative encourages data-driven analysis and focuses on problem solving. These principles promote awareness of new developments and encourage the community to share new and innovative solutions. The jewel in the crown of HACR research is the highly anticipated annual Corporate Inclusion Index. No publication has more impact on decisions involving Hispanic diversity and inclusion in corporate America today. In order to recognize those companies that the index has proven to be the true leaders in Hispanic diversity and inclusion, the HACR Research Institute created the Corporate Inclusion Index Awards. These awards highlight those 5-star companies whose Hispanic inclusion efforts and strategies have yielded the absolute best results. For close to 35 years, HACR has led the way in supporting Hispanic inclusion in corporate America. Come be a part of the movement. Come be a part of our community.
All right, there we go. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. Sorry for that little delay. Buenas tardes, mi gente. It's my pleasure to be here with you today. Welcome to our HACR webinar. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sid Wilson, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Hispanic Association on Corporate Responsibility, also known as HACR. I have the pleasure of hosting today's webinar. Today's session will feature a panel discussion with the HACR Research Institute team. The HACR Research Institute team will discuss the history and evolution of the HACR Corporate Inclusion Index. You'll learn how your company can establish a partnership with HACR through the Corporate Inclusion Index, as well as the benefits of the index as our corporate accountability measurement structure. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, type them into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel at the time during the presentation. Questions are only visible by our team, and questions will be addressed throughout the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be available via email to all webinar participants and posted on our archive page on our website at hacr.org. Now, without further ado, I'd like to pass it on to Alida Minkel to introduce herself and the HACR Research Institute team to start the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sid. Well, as Sid just mentioned, my name is Alida Minkel, and I'm the Data Analytics Manager here at HACR. I work with the Director of Corporate Accountability, who I will be introducing shortly, on the coordination of a wide range of research, database management, and reporting efforts for the HACR Research Institute's annual Corporate Inclusion Index survey, as well as the Latina Empower Her initiative, the HRI blog, and other publications. So let me begin by introducing my colleague, Dr. Lisette Garcia. Dr. Garcia is HACR's Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer. She is responsible for the ongoing operations of the organization, as well as the functionality of HACR's research, programs, and initiatives that drive sustainable growth. Dr. Garcia joined the HACR team in September 2012 as director of the HACR Research Institute to revitalize and develop a strategic plan and roadmap for the Institute. A trained researcher with a PhD in sociology from The Ohio State University, Dr. Garcia has dedicated her career to exploring educational and employment issues within the realm of corporate social responsibility, discrimination, and diversity and inclusion. So welcome, Dr. Garcia. Next, we have HACR's management consultant, Roxana Vergara. Roxana is an experienced management consultant and project manager, helping organizations enhance and build their marketing capabilities. Her career spans a range of managing diverse projects in the profit and nonprofit sectors, from client experience to business development and customer relationship management to business process re-engineering. She currently supports the HACR research team with a primary focus on the annual Corporate Inclusion Index survey, much like the Pips do for Gladys Knight. Welcome, Roxana. But last but certainly not least, please welcome HACR's Director of Corporate Accountability, Eric Lopez. Eric is responsible for analyzing and collecting data from HACR's Corporate Inclusion Index survey, using that data to evaluate the effectiveness of companies' diversity and inclusion efforts, and providing thought leadership on how to implement lasting and sustainable policy changes. For over 15 years, Eric has dedicated his professional career to justice, equity, and service. He's also a recent recipient of an American Express NGen Fellowship. So congratulations and welcome, Eric.
Thank you, Alida.
So I'm going to start with you, Eric, actually. Maybe in a couple sentences, very briefly, tell us, what is the HACR Corporate Inclusion Index?
Generally speaking, the Corporate Inclusion Index is a survey. It's administered annually to 4 main groups of organizations, companies across the United States. The first is HACR corporate members. The second would be Fortune 100 companies. The third are organizations and companies that have taken the survey previously. And the fourth would be companies that come to us independently and ask us to take the survey. Now, depending on who you are, what kind of organization you are, the survey can be different things. For the general public, the CII survey is the means which we, HACR, gain information on corporate America and their practices on Hispanic inclusion. We use that information to create and write a report every year, the Corporate Inclusion Index report, which the public is able to see on how the trends for corporate America are in any given year. For those who participate in the survey every year, it's a bit more than that. So the survey serves as a benchmarking tool. It tells any company that participates in every year where they are in that year with respect to their Hispanic inclusion practices. And if they've been with us for a couple of years, also how things have changed over a certain amount of time, over a certain amount of years. So the CII can be a tool for benchmarking and also a roadmap to success for future Hispanic inclusion practices.
Well, thank you. That was very robust and informative. Thank you. Lisette, because you are responsible for driving so much of the vision and goals for the HACR Research Institute, maybe you could talk about why the CII was created in the first place?
Thanks, Alida. And thanks everyone for joining us today for this conversation on the CII. The CII has been around for a number of years. It's not a new tool that we have here at HACR. It predates all of us that are actually on the webinar with you today. And so was sort of the creation of the team at the time at HACR in an effort to create a tool that I think would help companies understand how they were doing in terms of Hispanic inclusion in HACR's 4 areas of interest, but also help us understand how companies needed assistance and needed to think about what they could be doing differently. In its early days, it was very much of a ranking as opposed to a rating, and over the years has transitioned. And I think that move was quite helpful, not only for the companies that were taking the survey, but for us. Because ultimately it's not about which company might be necessarily the best, but how we can help all companies achieve a level of success when it comes to Hispanic inclusion. And so when we think about sort of the CII and how it's changed over time, and its history, it's really about creating something that helps us achieve our mission as an organization for increasing Hispanic representation, but also helps companies to achieve their goals in terms of Hispanic inclusion in what they're doing, whether that's employment, procurement, philanthropy, and or governance.
Yeah, and speaking about the CII predating all of us, Roxana has been here the longest of any of us. And Roxana, I'm hoping maybe you can speak to some of the historical participation trends of the CII, like how many companies there were at the beginning. I think you're muted, Roxana.
The CII was established in 2009, so it goes back about 11 years, and we did start with about 30 companies. And of those 30 companies, there are 15 that still are participating with us and have done so consistently over the years that we've hosted the CII. And we have seen incremental growth since 2017. We're averaging about 10% each year in growth.
Okay, great. I'd also like to remind our audience real quickly to use the Q&A feature in your webinar control panel to submit questions at any time. Also, Roxana, picking up where you just left off, since you've been working on the survey since the beginning, what would you say are some of the distinguishing hallmarks of the CII?
Sure. Yeah, I think what distinguishes the CII from many other surveys out there, I think first and foremost, it's a cross-industry sourced survey, and that is, a reflection of our collaborative partnerships that we have with our participating companies, right? So the questions are based on conversations that we've had with participants. A lot of innovative companies there, so they're driving the conversation, if you will, and this is how we help develop the survey, right? So that's one distinguishing hallmark. A second, I think, again, goes back to a focus on conversation, right? So the CII is a collection of data, but I think more so what's important is the conversation that we have around the data that is submitted, right? So we are actively promoting dialogue around what's being done. So that becomes a core aspect of what we do, right? So we are promoting dialogue between our points of contact at each of the participating organizations and ourselves, right? And then we're hoping that once we've had those conversations, those points of contacts obviously are going back to their organizations and sharing insights from our conversations with those people with their internal stakeholders, right? So that's a second hallmark. A third hallmark.
Roxana, can I jump in just to kind of build on that point
Sure.
quickly? So I think in addition to dialogue, I would say one of the things that separates the CII from some of the other tools that are out there is partnership. And I kind of alluded to this in the beginning, is that, from the onset, the CII was meant to be a partnership between us and the companies. And I think over the years, we've really seen that evolve. And that dialogue is crucial for helping us in those partnerships to understand what's working for them and also what's working for us, right? Because if a survey stays static year after year after year, well, then once companies reach a certain level, a certain threshold, there's nothing to push them to do better. And I think that that's part of the partnership that we see with the survey. And I think that, it is one of the things that is most unique about it. That, not only do we have sort of an idea of where we want the questions to go and the things we want to ask and measure, but we also want to know what companies want us to ask and want us to measure. And we're open to hearing that, and we're open to incorporating that into the survey, because it's a win-win for everyone that's involved in the survey. So this isn't, you know, a one-sided, we send you a survey, we ask you to fill it out, and we say, thanks, see you next year. You know, there's that dialogue, there's that partnership, there's that constant discussion and commitment to working together to ensure that we are actually advancing Hispanic inclusion, and that, you know, we're not just measuring and asking about the things that we're interested in, but we're also asking about the things that companies are interested in and that we think will benefit those companies. So I just wanted to expand on that a little bit, and make sure that people really understand that, you know, it's not a one-way street. It is very much a two-way road where, you know, we're working together to create the most useful tool for us and for them.
Right. Yeah, Lisette, I completely agree. And I think that's one of the things that might not be evident in any company's participating year. That the fact is that this is just as important for us to complete and fulfill our mission as it is for companies to benchmark themselves. Company participation and their feedback to us allows us to develop and evolve the tool in coming years. The CII has come a long way and has changed a whole lot since I've come on board to the HACR team in 2015. And those companies that have been with us the whole time, the 15 that Roxana had mentioned earlier, have seen this evolution of change over time. The survey itself and the tools that we use to report back to companies have all developed and changed. And we are going to continue to change and develop the tool to make it relevant to our companies and make sure that it serves their interests and needs in a way that also helps us fulfill our mission as an organization. Certainly this year, as you can imagine, things that are happening currently are going to impact how we look at and think about what our survey tool is and how it will best serve the corporate America community and the Hispanic community in years to come. So certainly I completely agree that it is a two-way street in all equal ways. It's no side of the lane has more, no side of the street rather has more lanes than the other. And I think that there's an equal exchange of information and benefits to participating in the survey.
Yeah, thank you. That's exactly, I think, the elements that really make the CII stand apart from other similar surveys. We did have an audience question, which they said, I'm new to HACR. Did I understand the how-to of the CII as a volunteer participation, meaning you only include the companies that request to be included / surveyed?
I can answer that if that's okay with everyone. So our methodology is that every year at the beginning of the cycle, which is usually January, in early January, we send out a call for participation. So those companies who participated in a previous year get told about this year's survey opening, and in most cases get sent a link to the survey. We also send a call for participation to Fortune 100 companies. Any company that was listed on the Fortune 100 in the previous year gets an invitation. Also, companies who are HACR corporate members and are not part of the previous two list of companies also get an extended invitation to participate in the survey. Other companies outside of these three lists find out about the survey either through their networks or through our website, and they too come to us and ask us about the survey. There's an exchange and communication between our team and their representatives, and if everyone is on the same page about what participation means and their readiness to do so that year, we send them a link as well. So those are the four main ways to really come to participate in the survey in any given year.
And Eric, what do you hope that companies that do decide to participate get from their participation in the CII?
Well, certainly, as we had mentioned earlier, it's a benchmarking tool. So we establish where companies are in any given year. The CII questions focus on previous year data, so this year's 2020 CII focuses on 2019 data. So from January 1st to December 31st of 2019, what were your practices? Did you have an internship program, for example? And was your internship program inclusive of Hispanics? Lots of questions like that, which try to establish whether or not you have the practices, the foundation for Hispanic inclusion at your organization. Then we also ask about outcomes. So if we're asking about your internship program, what is the demographic breakdown of your internship program? And then using that information, we calculate the proportion or percentage of interns that are Hispanic. And based on what the data that we've been collecting for several years now, we have established benchmarks for each of those outcomes. And if you've met the minimum, you get acknowledged and credited for meeting those minimums. So we hope that out of participation and finding out all of this information, that organizations, companies find out where they are and how far they've come. Do their practices as they are established within their organization, are they producing the outcomes that they hope to be producing with respect to Hispanic inclusion, or does something have to happen, change? Well, all of that information is discussed. We certainly do also share what works, what some folks might call best practices with organizations when we do know them, to help them develop and establish practices that will result in more inclusivity. And then finally, in that regard, in that respect, we hope that the CII and the documents that we provide serve as a roadmap. If you look at our rating tools, if you look at our rating documents, all the questions that we do rate, some companies won't get credit for all of them because either they don't have the practices yet, or they're not getting the outcomes they'd like to see yet. But even in those cases, the tool is extremely valuable in that it shows you where you are and where you can go. What are the potential areas of growth for your organization in our 4 pillars of economic reciprocity, which Lisette listed earlier as employment, procurement, philanthropy, and governance. And also, what are the lowest hanging fruit for you? There are some areas for organizations that are participating with us where they haven't received credit yet, but they're very close to developing those areas. They're very close to establishing programs in those areas. And so they can see ahead of establishing those programs where that will take them in terms of our rating and establishing inclusive practices within their company.
Can I add to this question too? Because I think, for me, one of the things, in addition to helping companies benchmark and kind of get an idea of where they are and how they're improving year after year, in addition to that, one of the things that I think that the tool helps companies really think about is sustainability. We have had companies in the past that have, and I'll just use the intern example that Eric mentioned, have not necessarily thought about how to create an internship program through a sustainable lens. And so what they did in 1 year was go out and secure 100, say, Hispanic interns to work with them for that 1 year. And yes, that reflected very positively on the survey in that year. But then the following year, when there wasn't really thought or planning put into how they would sustain that practice, rolled around, when the following year rolled around, they weren't able to then go out and secure 100 interns because the connection that they had made with the partner that provided them their diverse interns had sort of fizzled because there wasn't a strategy for what to do year after year with that particular partner. And so I think one of the things that we often try to highlight in those discussions of what you're doing and what's working and what's not working, and in our conversations where we share best practices for companies is this sustainable? And how can we make you think about the way to institutionalize this practice into what you're doing in a way that not only makes sense for you given your current year and the current situation, but also 2, 5, 7, 10 years down the road. And I think that for some companies, the ideas and the field of diversity and inclusion is a continuum, and some companies are very far along in that continuum, and some of them are on the other side. And when you think about it as a continuum, I think it's helpful because there isn't an end goal, there isn't a magic place that everyone needs to be at. It's where you are that's right for you at that time. And sustainability is part of helping to move you to that next level. It's part of helping you move back and forth on that continuum. And when you don't care enough for sustainability and you don't think about it and plan for it in an appropriate fashion, you find yourself really waffling backwards. Which isn't one of the things that we want to happen with companies who take the CII, right? When we find something that works and when we find something that you're successful at, we want more of that to continue in other areas. So that sustainability piece is also key in how we think about what we want companies to get out of the survey.
Yeah, I completely agree, Lisette. And it's that model, that thinking is built into even our rating tool, in that we do have thresholds, as I mentioned earlier, which establishes in most cases a minimum percentage for each of the items that we measure, like internship. But those thresholds do change over time. The entire tool is a living document, it's a living tool. And so over time, when we see trends changing and those thresholds being met by most of our participants, they do change. They do, in most cases, go up. But we don't move them up in such a way where they become unattainable for newer participants. What we understand also is that many companies are in a different level with respect to their diversity inclusion practices for a variety of reasons. And what we don't want to do is make these benchmarks so far out of reach that they can never get there. Or encourage what Lisette was just talking about, which is to go out and, you know, get 100 interns or hire 500 new Hispanic employees and not have the foundations to support that growth. So it's very important for us and for our participants to understand that the tool tells you where you are right now, but what we're encouraging, what we can do for you as an organization is help you figure out a way to grow incrementally, sustainably over time. We make no value judgments about where companies are in any given year. It's not a way for us to tell you that you're good or bad. The fact that you come and talk to us, the fact that you're coming to the table and having the conversation and trying to find out a way to get better, that's all we ask as an organization. So we are very appreciative of our companies, irrespective of where they are, irrespective of whether or not they're a 5-star in any one of our 4 pillars. We appreciate their participation and encourage them to continue to do so, to find better ways to be more inclusive of Hispanics.
And just building on that last point, Eric, you know, there really is no value judgment. We're not going to say you're a bad company if you, you know, are in the early stages of your Hispanic inclusion strategy, right? We're not, that isn't what the tool is meant to do anymore. It may have been how it started, you know, 12 years ago, but it's not where it's evolved to over time. You know, it is, as I mentioned earlier, about partnership. It's about dialogue. It is about really thinking, how can we help you achieve your goals around Hispanic inclusion? Because in doing that, it helps us achieve our mission, right? So it's that win-win situation. And I think that every company is unique. Every company is in a different place on that continuum. And so the things that we provide are really determined by where you are and what your company is doing and what you've tried that's worked. And you know, where we, I think, can provide the best value is in making those recommendations and getting you to see, because you'd be surprised how many companies aren't evaluating the initiatives that they have in place, aren't tracking them, and certainly not in a centralized across the business unit way. lots of business units track certain things that are happening within those individual units, but more broadly across the whole enterprise, there oftentimes isn't the structure in place to be able to track everything that's happening. And I think one of the things that participation in the CII encourages companies to do is to think about that enterprise-wide strategy for assessing what's in place, how is it working, what can we tweak, what should we stop doing because it's not working, and what should we do more of, right? And so that's really the idea behind the survey and encouraging companies to participate.
Yeah, and you know, it can be a scary process, particularly for first-time participants to open up in this way. We understand, but really the CII is from what I can tell, one of the most risk-free ways to make this analysis, to make this, to benchmark that there is out there. We do not publish your ratings to the public unless you're a 5-star company. And even in that instance, what a 5-star is remains a conversation between us and the companies. While we do share information with the public to inform them about how corporate America is doing overall, we don't tell the public about individual company responses. And the reason why we moved in that direction is because we want to establish trust relationships with these organizations so that they can feel comfortable talking to us about where they are, what they're struggling with, and for us to find ways to help them get better. A lot of times companies shy away from participating, even given all of that, for a variety of reasons. But really the trade-off is in not finding out where you are, not benchmarking, not tracking these things. The trade-off is between temporary discomfort and long-term dysfunction. If nothing changes, particularly in this day and age, problems and issues could arise as a result of that. And what we're trying to do also is provide companies a safe space to help them move forward with the practices that will help them become more inclusive.
Yeah, so what I hear from your responses here is that, you know, like the title of this webinar says, the CII really is a tool meant to be a roadmap, right? A living, breathing roadmap that is not, you know, static. It's changes as, you know, companies change and the world changes. And so maybe, Eric, you could talk more about where exactly this roadmap is going and tie that into an audience member question that we had about whether you could provide more examples of what the survey entails for those interested and new to the CII.
So with respect to the roadmap, I mean, in each of the 4 pillars, companies are assessed separately. We used to do an overall rating where we gave companies an overall rating on their responses in all 4 of our pillars. But we moved away from that model because what was happening was that there were different developmental stages in each of these 4 pillars, particularly in philanthropy and procurement. Companies are still developing models of tracking and diversity and inclusion practices in these 2 areas. And so if they weren't doing so well there, but doing great in employment and governance, the overall rating was burying that success. So in order to help uplift their success and acknowledge their success in those areas, and also keep track of how and where they need to improve and continue to work, we split up the rating into 4 separate ratings. So now HACR does a rating in each of those 4 areas separately from each other. There is no overall rating. But what that helps us do is also provide a roadmap in each of those 4 areas as well. So you will see how far along you are with respect to your practices and outcomes in employment, procurement, philanthropy, and governance, and also where the gaps are, where some of the low-hanging fruits are in each of those 4 areas to develop and increase your score year after year.
Okay, perfect. Well, I just want to mention to the audience real quick that we are getting a lot of questions in, and if we don't get an opportunity to answer all of them, we will be answering all of them in the post-event blog recap. So keep an eye out for that. Roxana, I'm going to gear this next audience member question to you. You mentioned the internship example. How do you use these benchmarks to help companies develop pipelines all the way from internship to executives? I find at my company that I have recruit and mentor Latinos in this capacity informally, and there isn't much support from HR once we recruit folks here for an internship.
Okay, good question. So we definitely want to talk about the distinction between diversity and inclusion, right? So this is a prime example of this, right? So the metrics help us assess representation, right? So in employment, procurement, and philanthropy, we can see that. But I think the culture piece is critical to ensuring that the inclusion part takes place, and this is symptomatic of the question that was asked is symptomatic of some of the lack of support that you're getting from leadership, and we examine that in governance, right? So we look at governance and try to assess what the leadership looks like, if it's reflective of the population, right? So I examine some practices within that area to determine, what's the culture like, right? So is it supportive of diversity, right? Is it inclusive? So that is part of the conversation that we have. So if you're not taking the survey and you would like to see what the assessment might turn out, that might be a way to kind of examine fully what's going on throughout your organization, not just from an HR standpoint. So we take a pretty holistic look at the enterprise through these 4 pillars.
And internships is one thing that we ask about in the survey, and I'm hoping Eric or Lisette or anyone could chime in and discuss maybe some of example topics or areas we ask about for each pillar and why.
I can do that, sure. So each of the 4 pillars on the survey is split up into separate areas. So there are a total of, I believe, 11 sections in the entire survey, and those 11 sections make up some of the four pillars. For employment, we have talent development and recruitment, and we have ERG questions, among others. In procurement, we have spend amount and development questions like whether or not you provide financial assistance to your Hispanic suppliers, whether or not you require certification, among other things. In philanthropy, we ask about giving amounts. So for your corporation, foundation, if you have one, and in-kind give. And we also ask about your hours, volunteer hours, and whether or not you calculate a dollar value for those volunteer hours, and where those hours are being given in the community. And finally, for governance, we ask you about your board composition, what the composition of your leadership at the organization is, your class A, B, and C, or the direct reports to the CEO, 2 levels down and 3 levels down. We also ask about your pipeline, so whether or not what the proportion of your exempt employees looks like, what your demographics look like for exempt employees, as well as whether or not you have diversity statements in any of your SEC filings, if you have SEC filings. So a great variety of questions. We cover the gamut. It is a 200+ question survey, most of which are yes, no, multiple choice questions. Most of those questions do inform the ratings. So each of the 4 pillars has a rating comprised of 25 practice area points and 5 outcomes assessment points. And those 5 outcomes assessments are the quantitative questions about your employee demographics and questions like that. How much spend or how much giving do you do? And so that's pretty much runs the gamut on what kind of questions we're looking at, how many questions there are, and how we use them. I think one step further, once the survey cycle is over, we gather the information for all of the companies that participated, and we use that information to inform our annual CII report. And so if you look at last year's report, for example, we have information on the average spend with Hispanic suppliers. We have the average employee representation numbers for exempt, non-exempt, and your class A, B, and C employees. We also have some data points on Latina representation, particularly with respect to the board and leadership at the organization. So we do use the information, we do use the data to inform our reports and inform the general public about how corporate America is doing. Corporate America, in turn, can take that report once it's published and compare the results to their own personalized results and see where they compare to the rest of the participants in any given year.
Alida, if I could just expand a little bit on what Eric is talking about in terms of the types of questions that we ask and the information that we collect. There was a question from the audience that asked a little bit about with companies becoming more global and there being expats and also folks that are not US citizens working for those companies, how do we handle that, and how do we care for the nuances in the data, so to speak, that won't necessarily show that things are really great for Hispanics in the United States when it's based on data that's not in the United States or people who are not in the United States, right? And one of the ways that we try and care for that in what we ask about is when we collect data for US-based operations for companies. And Eric, feel free to chime in and expand on this if I miss something, but we're looking primarily what's happening at corporate headquarters and ask people when they respond to the survey questions to tell us specifically what's happening for US-based operations. And with something like governance, and we've done this in the past, although it's not currently part of it, but we have another survey that looks specifically at the leadership of companies. We also ask companies to identify who are US born Latinos that may be serving on their board versus those that are from another country, oftentimes South America. We see a lot of very prominent South American executives serving on corporate boards for US-based companies. And so we try to collect as much information as possible to separate those two groups and to really help us understand, because I think, the history, and not to go too far down this rabbit hole, but the history in the United States in terms of immigrant incorporation and in terms of access to resources for Black and Brown populations is one that hasn't necessarily proved to be kind. And as a result of that, we see things like lagging behind in educational achievement and or as well as in occupational outcomes, and although we've seen improvements in both of those things over time, US Hispanics are not quite on par with their non-Hispanic white peers, and we don't want to mask that in what we collect in the CII, because we know that if we didn't take that into consideration, it would skew the results. So we do ask specifically about that, and not just in the governance section. When we ask companies to report their employment data or their procurement data in particular, right, we're asking them what they're doing with US-based suppliers, what they're doing in terms of their US-based workforce, how they're working with US-based philanthropies, right? And we are even so specific that we ask about whether or not those philanthropies are considered Hispanic-led versus I'm struggling on the other terminology that we use, where we're asking, is the organization that you're working with, is their mission specifically to serve the US Hispanic population, or is it a larger philanthropic organization that by virtue of how demographics are shifting is working with a Hispanic population, right? And so an example might be the difference between working with HACU, for example, one of HACR's coalition members, and working with the United Way of Greater Miami-Dade County, where the United Way of Miami is not a Hispanic organization in their mission, right? But because of what the demographics are of Miami-Dade, they may be serving a Hispanic population. Compared to HACU, whose mission is to serve the Hispanic population. So we have really thought at length and in depth about how we should craft these questions and the kinds of things that we're asking about to care for those nuances, to ensure that there aren't really, as the audience member asked, there aren't any false positives, right? We really do try and care for that in what we do.
Yeah, and I will add an audience member question to that, because you guys just, were discussing, the types of questions we ask and why we're asking them, and how nuanced we get into discussing opportunities and successes with companies. Do you offer suggestions for organizations to move forward with meaningful diversity initiatives when they take the CII? And if so, how do you do that?
Yes, we sure do, especially whenever we can. We take advantage of the opportunity to do so. One of the areas which we often do that in is in philanthropy. Philanthropy is one of the two areas which I mentioned earlier. Is the companies across the country are still developing their tracking mechanisms for telling where their money is going, where their contributions are going, where their volunteer hours are going. And in many cases, the hurdle for them to be able to report this information and know exactly where their efforts are being spent is the ability to track by racial and ethnic demographic, by racial and ethnic demographics. So what we tell companies is that, what we have seen from organizations that are successful in this pillar, what we have heard time and time again about how they're doing this is that there are only basically three models. And the first is you have an internal mechanism to track where your money is going, where your hours are going. You have a third party that you have contracted with to help you track those hours and contributions, or you have a combination of the two. So you have an internal mechanism where you're tracking some of those demographic figures or some of that information, but there's some gaps. And so in order to help you fill those gaps, you hire the third party. And so what we have done is, over the years, and particularly over the last 2 years, we have shared that information with companies who are not there yet. So we tell them, hey, look, this is what we have seen that works. This is what other companies who are successful here, this is what they're doing. Particularly for practices where we have heard time and time again that this is what most of the companies are doing. I hesitate to call them best practices because I don't think that in most cases, this is just based on my experience, that there is a one-size-fits-all solution for companies. Companies are, and I've learned this over the 5 years that I've worked at HACR, companies are very unique and individual, and the solution for one company usually, if not always, is not a solution for another company. The solution has lessons that certainly can be learned from, but that lesson and those solutions have to be tailor-fitted for the new company where you're going to apply it. And so we give that information to companies, and hopefully they take that and retrofit it to fit into their model, their culture, and their organization in order to engender more success in these areas.
Thank you, Eric. So I know we've really just touched the tip of the iceberg of the CII. There's so much that we could discuss, but I do want to kind of shift our focus over to what you are currently doing to continue evolving the survey, especially considering everything that companies have been facing this year. Where do you see it going?
Is that for all of us?
Whoever wants to answer.
Why don't you kick us off, Eric?
Okay. So where do we want to see it going? So certainly this year has been an interesting one, to say the least. And we do understand as an organization that what has happened and what continues to happen will likely have an effect on many of the practices that we track and measure. What that will mean in terms of what's coming next year and in coming years, we're still having internal discussions about that. We're being as flexible and responsive as possible. But in the development of the 2021 survey, we certainly are considering what that will mean. So that's the immediate future. But in terms of where things are going next with the survey and what we hope to develop, as I said, we take participant feedback and suggestions very seriously. And so that oftentimes informs how things change. It could be as minor as how one word is interpreted across industries to entire question types being added or taken away, depending on what the needs of the organizations are. This doesn't happen very quickly because we do have to make an assessment and perform some research on what the best practice for us is to move forward. But we certainly take that into account. And I think that extending it out further into the future, our homework and what we hope to develop is a means to continue to challenge the organizations that take the survey with us every year to continue to improve, particularly those that are at the top tier of our categories. So if you're already a 5-star company, have been a 5-star company for a number of years, what's next? Well, I certainly am thinking about that a lot these days. And so the future for the CII is developing tools to help companies continue to move forward in their diversity inclusion practices.
And I would add too, in terms of thinking about the future, earlier we discussed how we don't want it to be static, right? And the thresholds that we use to determine whether or not, the company meets the criteria or not, those change on an annual basis. As do some of the measures, right? We have constant conversations about, is there a better way for us to be measuring how well companies are doing with supplier diversity, for example? And, so we see and incorporate those changes into what the survey is doing. So it is, in a process of evolution almost constantly, right? But we're careful in what that evolution looks like and how we do it so that we don't lose the ability to compare over time, right? Because certainly as a data person, there's value to me and to HACR and to the companies that participate in the survey to be able to say, okay, this is what we looked like in 2010, this is what we looked like in 2012, and so on and so forth. So we're careful in how we evolve it so that we don't lose that ability to compare points across time. And I will say too, in response to the question that was posed about COVID, and to build on what Eric was saying, we don't know exactly how that's going to affect us. Certainly this year we're seeing an impact of it as companies are needing to divert resources into other areas. Perhaps the teams that would have been working on the survey are busy focused on other things, and we get that and we understand that, and there's no penalty to them, for having to redirect those resources. For the companies that have completed the survey this year, we don't anticipate seeing an effect on their data this year because it's always 1 year lagging, right? So the data we collect this year is actually last year's data. So we anticipate that there'll be some kind of effect on next year's cycle. And, we'll care for that and take that into consideration as we're thinking about what the thresholds should be potentially for next year. So, there are ways that we think about the evolution. There's a path we'd love to go on, right? We'd love to be able to say that we have all 500 companies of, say, the Fortune 500 who participate, and which would allow us to then do cross-industry or within industry comparison or within peer company comparisons. There's a laundry list of things that we have in terms of the evolution of the CII, and we're slowly but surely getting there. And we're excited for the possibilities that the survey still has for us and for the companies that participate.
Hey, well, great. I think we should wrap up the discussion there since, like I said before, we could go on for ages. We've got a panel full of data nerds here. We could go on and on. But maybe you could talk more about what companies can find out, how companies can find out more if they are interested in participating.
Sure. So participation for this year is all but done. So what companies who are interested to participate in the following year in 2021 can do is reach out to us using the email that you see on your screen. Also, please feel free to go to our website and download our 2019 report. We also have, I saw a couple of questions on STEM and how Hispanics are doing in STEM. There's also a report on STEM and other topic areas like Latinas as well. Starting in November, we will be reaching out to companies who fit into those 4 categories that I mentioned earlier, and we will start telling them about preparation for 2021. The 2021 survey will open in early January, usually the first or second week when we're back from vacation, and then it'll stay open through April, about sometime in mid to late April. So that's what you need to know to participate. And also, participation is completely free. We do not charge companies to participate in our survey. So I think I saw that question as well.
The only thing I'd add is stay tuned for the 2020 report. As that cycle winds down, we're getting ready to release that report in September. So stay tuned for that report's release towards the end of the month of September.
Right.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you, Eric, Lisette, and Roxana for taking the time to talk with us today. I will hand it back over to Sid Wilson to sign us off.
Thanks, Alida, and thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And of course, a thank you to Alida, Eric, Lisette, and Roxana for your time and efforts and the great content that you presented today. Without your commitment to us, our work would not be possible. I also want to thank the audience for attending today's webinar session. We hope that you got great insights on how the HACR Corporate Inclusion Index can be used as a roadmap to develop your Hispanic inclusion strategy. As the saying goes, what gets measured gets done. Just as a reminder, of course, if you do need to contact the research team, you can email them at research@hacr.org, that's HACR.org. Also, follow us on all social media platforms to stay up to date on all of our latest news. And remember to please complete the survey that will automatically pop up once the webinar ends. Feel free to visit us at hacr.org to register for our upcoming webinars. We have a series of webinars that we'll be doing throughout the summer and going into the fall. And we hope that you can participate in our upcoming webinars. So with that, thank you very much, and we will see you soon. Thank you very much for your support of the Hispanic Association on Corporate Responsibility. Have a great day.